Detroit ends up beating Tampa Bay by 8 points. 31-23 was the final, the divisional round. The Lions are into the NFC Championship game for the first time in 32 years, 1991, and just the second time in their pathetic franchise's history. So the Lions win 2 playoff games. Playoffs! They win 2 playoff games in a season for the first time since 1957. The last time that happened, and that was last year they won an NFL championship. There was no Super Bowl in 1957. They won the NFL title, and they had 2 postseason games at home for the first time. All the historical numbers of a team that usually doesn't even make the playoffs. The only time we see the Lions is on Thanksgiving, and that's because they're grandfathered in on Thanksgiving. But these aren't your daddy's Lions or your granddaddy's or your great-granddaddy's or your great-great-great-granddaddy's Lions. No. But the better story here is actually in the losing locker room. So that is where we are going to start. So the question, does this result, a Lions win over Tampa, does this say more about the Bucs? Or does this say more about Jared Goff? Because all the stories that I'm reading are glowing reviews about Jared Goff. That they were chanting his name, rhythmically chanting his name at Ford Field in Detroit. So to answer the question, does this result say more about the Buccaneers or more about Jared Goff? The arrow on this one is pointing towards Tampa. I've got Yiddish, Lake Michigan, and Barney the Dinosaur, and we'll put all these things together, and we're going to make an avalanche is what we're going to make. We're going to make an avalanche. So not the Colorado Avalanche, just an avalanche. So number one. Yes, number one. So this was on the Buccaneer defense, which statistically was not all that great. You wouldn't know that from the broadcast, but they were holding down the fort. They were getting their job done. They were doing their job in this game, the Buccaneer defense. Todd Bowles with a defensive background. And then as we got into the second half, it was a breakfast cereal, snap, crackle, pop. And that's what happened to the Buccaneers defense. Now, you still have to play the game. You have backups that come in there, do your job. I believe in that. Well, they didn't do their job. The guys that came in, the scrubs, that came in for the Buccaneers defensively in the second half and really late third quarter into the fourth quarter were not good. They were not. And Jared Goff, who for 75% of this game was the guy we thought he was, wasn't very good. Right? Every story is saying how great Jared Goff was. He wasn't very good for 75% of the game. And once the injuries started piling up, Jared Goff then took off. And there's a term for the way Goff played most of this game. It's a term, Yiddish term, verkakta. Jared Goff played a verkakta game for 75%, and he was on the ropes for most of that time. Was outplayed by Baker Mayfield. Baker had an early interception, but it was not his fault. That was on Mike Evans, who had the ball bounce off his hands. That was on the receiver. But over the first 3 quarters, I'll give you my evidence here on Jared Goff and why these glowing stories about how good Jared Goff was are bullcrap. All right, so Jared Goff, first 3 quarters of the game, averaged 3.8 yards per pass attempt. He was 19 of 41, less than 50% on pass completions at the first 3 quarters of the game, and had less than 160 yards passing through 3 quarters of the game. The game was tied going to the fourth quarter, and then once the backups came in for the Buccaneers, Jared Goff put his cape on and went up, up, and away to the moon. Attempted 12 passes in the fourth quarter, completed 11 of them, averaged almost 11 yards per pass attempt, and had the touchdown. So that is a byproduct of the cast-offs, the rubbish that were playing for the Buccaneers who didn't do their job. And Jared Goff, to his credit, took advantage. But my problem is the uneducated fan, the low-information fan that says, well, Jared Goff was electric. This was his defining moment. He got the Lions. He put them on their back, or his back, and carried them into the NFC title game. It's just not true. You got to read the fine print. And, tell me you didn't watch the game without telling me you didn't watch the game. Now, speaking of watching the game and the nuance of the game, A lot of people up in arms. Buccaneers coach Todd Bowles is under fire. Why? I'll tell you. So there were a pair of decisions that Todd Bowles made that rocked the axis of the NFL. I say that dramatically, but there were people upset. Of course, people get upset about everything these days, so it's not really surprising. So what are the two decisions? Let me walk you through this. So Todd Bowles went for two. The Buccaneers scored a touchdown with 4:41 on the clock. They decided to go for two. The two-point conversion did not work. It failed. So instead of being down by 7 trying to get the ball back, they were down by 8 trying to get the ball back. And then at the end of the game, Todd Bowles decided not to call his final timeout. Tampa, had he called the timeout, would have forced the Lions to either attempt a field goal and it would have been a long field goal, or at that particular juncture would have gotten the ball back themselves, would have had a couple of shots down by 8. And so here's Todd Bowles when asked about the decision at the end of the game. Here's Todd Bowles commenting on what went through his mind. Take a listen.
They already had a field goal and lined up, and it would have been about 12 seconds left on the clock to end the ball game. We weren't going to come back from that. No sense of prolonging the obvious.
All right, so he just dismissed the idea that a kicker would miss a field goal because we know that doesn't happen, right? Ask the Bills about that. Okay, so the toss-up question on this, which of these two decisions by Todd Bowles, the two-point conversion, you would have been down by 7, you try to cut it to 6, instead you're down by 8, the two-point conversion by Todd Bowles, or the decision by Todd Bowles to not use his final timeout, which of these two calls is more redonkulous? So after a minutes-long MALLER investigation, this one's actually not that hard. It's not that difficult. The one that stands out like a sore thumb is the decision not to use the final timeout. I actually didn't have a problem with the two-point call. Of course, I also took Tampa Bay plus 6.5, so if that two-point conversion had worked, I would have won my bet, so I would have been happy at that regard. But that aside, the decision at the end of the game here, in all seriousness, and what are you doing? You're assuming the Lions are going to make the field goal. In a world where kickers shank field goal attempts all the time, as again we saw for the Buffalo Bills, and we saw Green Bay miss a field goal, the pressure of the field goal kicker in the postseason is immense, and never underestimate. And this is the mistake that Todd Bowles made. He underestimated tight tuchus syndrome. So let's say there's only 12 seconds left after the field goal attempt. Okay, you got 2 shots. All it takes is a pass interference penalty by the Lions, which is more than they commit pass interference pretty much every play when I watch the Lions. They're secondary. They're always touchy-feely with the opposing wide receivers. So you get a pass interference penalty, and bam, you're in business. And it would have been one of the great moments in NFL history, but Todd Bowles decided, I want to keep that timeout. I'm just going to concede defeat. That's a loser's attitude. That is a loser's attitude by Todd Bowles. Now, here's the deal. Look at the math. We'll use MALLER math on this. So, essentially, Todd Bowles, he's chopping wood. He took his axe. He threw it into Lake Michigan. He said, that's it. I don't need my axe. I'm throwing it into Lake Michigan. He gave a concession speech. And the math on this, the Lions had, under the Todd Bowles plan, they had 0 chance in a million of winning the game because they didn't even bother calling the timeout. The Lions actually screwed this up. They ran a snap too soon. That's why Tampa Bay would have had the chance to get the ball back. And the thing, and we've all heard this growing up, right? You never assume, right? The old saying that we've heard when we were growing up is you never assume, because when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. So even at 1 in 1 million or 1 in a trillion, that's still better than 0 out of a trillion, which is the path that Todd Bowles took. And you don't get to carry the timeout over. I don't, maybe I'm wrong on this. I just do the overnight show. I don't think you get to take the timeout, and then the first game next year, the Bucs get an extra timeout because Todd Bowles pocketed the timeout. Right? I mean, what are you doing? You're assuming that the kicker is going to make the field goal. And who knows, maybe the Lions don't even attempt the field goal at that point because a 49-yard field goal attempt is not guaranteed. The choke factor is very high. All right, final point. Now, somehow the Minnesota Vikings entered the chat here. The Vikings not playing in the postseason. They didn't qualify, but their wide receiver, Justin Jefferson, calling out big NFL, big football. Now, why is this? Now, Justin Jefferson was furious with the NFL's social media arm. What was he upset about? He was upset because during a celebratory posting on X about the Lions, the NFL posted a photo of a Lions fan's poster, and on the photo, it had a checklist. It said kneecap Vikings, other kneecap Rams. Then it said chunk out of them Bucks, and it had check, check, check. There's a check next to each of those. Okay, what's the problem? Next, you had the last one. You had the NFC title game, and then you had last one standing. So Justin Jefferson wrote, "You all wild," he said. "You all wild for posting this. Thumbs down emoji. This ain't cool." So what are your thoughts on Justin Jefferson, Minnesota Viking player, saying it's just not cool? This just ain't cool because the NFL posted a photo of a fan sign that upset him. So my response is, you've come a long way, baby, in the NFL and how soft the modern player is, Justin Jefferson. If I was the Vikings, I saw this, I'd be like, we got to trade this guy. This guy's a loser. Justin Jefferson's a freaking loser, right? We've gone from, think about the Vikings. And when I was a kid, people talked about the Vikings. They said, people purple eaters, the Minnesota Vikings, purple people eaters. Now they've got Barney the dinosaur and friends in Justin Jefferson, who's out there. I mean, what is that? Tell me you're soft without telling me you're soft. It was a tribute to Dan Campbell and his quote, dummy. What did you think? Oh, this is going to encourage violence. Yeah, I'm sure. Okay. All right. My God. What a pathetic comment.